to this computer. Hey everyone, welcome back to The Satisfied Philosophy. I'm here today with Matthew Adelstein. He runs the Substack Bentham's Bulldogs, and he talks a lot about theology, philosophy of mind, philosophy of morals. So today I'm going to be talking largely about universalism with Matthew, as he's kind of been on a kick of universalism recently. Now, I want to preface, Matthew can talk more about this, but he does not identify as a Christian, though he's interested in universalism as like sort of a philosophical possibility and sort of engaging with that argument. But he does not personally identify as Christian at this time. So,
I'd
um,
say I give Christianity maybe like 15% odds of being true at this point.
okay. Okay.
Um,
Yeah. So we're going to talk about that today and subscribe to Matthew's and Thumbs Bulldogs. Great
let's do it.
Substack.
You
Really
should do
fun.
that. Very
Really good.
important.
Yeah. And yeah, thank you guys. Take the floor.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's who I am.
Mhm.
Uh, I have a blog where I talk about a variety of topics. A lot of them have to do with philosophy. Some of them don't have to do with
Mhm.
philosophy. I sometimes write about like random culture war
I
things.
saw, yeah, those political ones don't interest me, but I see those. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's who I am. I'm in university studying philosophy.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
But yeah. So I kind of just want to ask some questions and then we can kind of just go back and forth. So I guess the first thing is, do you think that the biblical argument or the philosophical argument is stronger for universalism?
I think probably the philosophical argument, just
Yeah.
because I think that the philosophical argument, like the biblical argument, gets into some tortured textual analysis, and while I think overall it favors universalism, it's not as much of a slam dunk. There are
Hmm.
certain biblical passages that if you read them out of context, or even if you read them in context, they seem at least on their face to
Hmm.
support infernalism. And
Yeah.
so it can be difficult to see, okay, when you consider the passages, how they end up supporting universalism. Now, I think basically near pretty much all the passages that people use to support infernalism just rely from contentiously translating the word ionios. So there's the word ionios,
Yeah.
and it
I would say that there's two passages which really give me a hard time. Um, it's the first one is in Second Thessalonians chapter 1, and it's where Paul says, I'll pull up the exact passage right now, actually. But it doesn't use Ionios. It uses a word for destruction. Chapter one, and ba, ba, ba. Yeah, yeah, it's chapter one, verse 9. They will be punished with everlasting destruction and shut out from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might. And if I pull up my Greek New Testament, hold on. Don't believe it uses Ionios. Chapter one. Mm, mm, da, 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 and 9. Yeah, it uses Ionion. So Ionion would be the like the more clear version of eternality. Um
is
s-
I thought that I know Greek, so I might be totally wrong about
mhm.
this, but I thought that ionion was roughly equivalent to ionios, like same origin of the word. Like I thought it
um
was
it's
ionios conjugated
it's
differently.
a it's I wouldn't say it's exactly equal, but it's not as bad as like iodios or like one of those words, right? So it's not as clear as ionios, which just means like onto the end of the age or unto the age, but it still has that ambiguous meaning, which can mean more. But I do think that, and the word for destruction here is also really difficult. It's ionion. Prosopau. Prosopo. Prosopo. Yeah. Okay. No, no. Tisusin. Tisusin is the word for destruction. Prosopo is to worship. Yeah. Tisusin is the word for destruction. So it's saying that, I mean, it's a little, I don't know. It's a bit, that's a hard passage for me. I say that that one is probably the hardest passage in the New Testament, in
Yeah,
against universalism, I think, in my view.
I mean, I guess a few points. One of them is I think that there are just a huge number of passages supporting universalism,
Hmm.
such that, and I think some of them are much clearer than this
Hmm.
one, such that I think that it overall favors universalism.
Agreed.
And so, like, if there was like, imagine there was one biblical passage that out of context seemed to say there is no God.
Hmm.
Well, the fact that you read it in the context of the rest of the Bible should lead you to conclude that that's not, in fact, what it was saying, at least if you're an inerrantist.
I'm
Second
not,
of
but
all,
yeah.
if I forget the exact word, but if that can in some like, it, I think we would well, even if you're an inerrantist, I think it wouldn't be that surprising if sometimes just the like most in direct reading of the text is a little bit misleading. Like, if you read things in a very, very direct way,
Hmm.
you'll sometimes be misled. And so if Ionios, was it Ionios? Was
It was
that it?
Ionion, the one in the second
Ionion.
test, yeah.
Yeah. So if Ionion usually means eternal, it wouldn't be surprising if it in one context meant something else. And beyond that,
Hmm.
I don't think there are any good ones. And then third of all,
Hmm.
if you deny biblical inerrantism, then I think then the case is even more decisive, where you can just like, yeah, Paul got
Yeah,
it wrong.
I do. I
He
completely deny
sometimes,
it.
yeah, he sometimes
What are
comes
your thoughts on like using Old Testament passages in favor of universalism? Because I see you use Lamentations, and then you use something in Daniel, and then this is your blog post I'm referring to. You use a couple of Old Testament passages, and I personally don't do that. Because I take the view that the evolution there was an evolutionary understanding of who God was throughout history, right? And the earliest writings we have in the Old Testament show this very different portrayal of God that is much more influenced by the political desires and current ideologies of this tribe of peoples in the Near East, rather than a more divine enunciation that you find in the New Testament and the later fathers and the ecumenical councils. So I was just wondering, do you agree with that view, or do you take the more conservative view that no, monotheism has always been in the Old Testament? They've always believed in one God. There's not this pantheon of gods that was, you know.
it's not a topic that I've studied very much, but
Hmm.
I think my sense is that early on in the days of the Old Testament, they believed in multiple gods. I mean,
Yeah.
like, I mean, in Genesis,
Hmm.
it says, we create man in
Yeah.
our image. Now,
Yeah.
okay, if you're a Trinitarian, maybe the
Yeah.
Trinitarian
That's
think that
reading it back, but I do think that a Christian must necessarily read later Christian doctrine to the Old Testament. But if I'm taking an academic view of the Old Testament, I'm obviously going to know that that doesn't mean Trinitarianism, right?
read.
Yeah.
So I guess so. Now, I mean, the ones I was citing. Well, first of all, I think most of the people who are not universalists,
Hmm.
like a lot of people, have a pretty literal reading of the Bible,
Hmm.
where they think that the Old Testament is also divine, and maybe there are no errors, maybe there are just a few errors, and so on such a picture, I think they like it'll still be effective for convincing lots of people, right?
Hmm.
If you're sort of a like soyed out liberal, where
Real, real.
right, where you think, okay, maybe the Bible just says some false things sometimes, then
Hmm.
then I think it's just clear you should be a universalist, because of the philosophical arguments, and the
Hmm.
scriptural arguments shouldn't move you as much. But the idea is just, even if you have a very, very literalistic reading of the scripture, then you should take note of the fact that in Lamentations, for example, it
Hmm.
says no one is cast off by the Lord forever.
Hmm.
The other thing is that the verses that I was citing were not primarily very early. They were not primarily in the Torah. They were mostly in later books in the
True.
Pentateuch.
Daniel was written in the second century
Right.
BC,
Right.
and
I think the one, I mean, I don't remember all the ones I cited off the top of my head, but
hmm.
I cited the one from Lamentations.
Yep.
And that one I think is especially good because it's specifically talking about the nature of God's wrath, where it says God gets angry at people, but it's so that they turn away from their wicked ways, and he's never angry at you forever. So
Yeah.
I think taking that seriously rules out universalism. So I definitely think that the best passage for universalism, I think, in the entire in the entire Bible is I have trouble remembering verses off the
Sure.
top of my head, but it's
Yeah.
the one from Romans, where it
Yep.
says,
Romans
"As in Adam,
5:18.
Yeah, as in Adam all died, so in Christ all will be made alive. And then I
Mhm.
also think the ones in, I think, Philippians, where it
Philippians
says,
2:10 to 11.
yeah, wow, okay, wow, you're just insane with these, you know all them off the
I
top of
wrote
your
a
head.
book. I.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I should just make like flashcards with them so
Yeah.
that I can impress people with my Bible knowledge. So I think, yeah, I think for a lot of that where it says that as that um every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. And if
Yep.
you look at the words for bow and
Yep.
confess, the word for
Pandione
bow
compse and
is,
exomologieste are two
yeah,
words that are
right.
only
And like,
used in a joyous
right, they
fashion
all
throughout
are
the old.
used in a venerating context.
Yep.
Right. Now, I think maybe if you're an annihilationist, you can explain it, but it's a much weirder explanation. Like it's a much less direct reading where you can say,
Yeah.
like, at some point, like if I said everyone will bow down to Darth Vader or
Hmm.
something, it would be weird to say, well, what that really means is not everyone will bow down, but the ones who won't bow down will be killed, such that at some future point, everyone in the world is bowing down. And it
Hmm.
especially, yeah, I mean, the infernalist reading is both doesn't comport with the Greek grammar,
Hmm.
as various scholars have described, have discussed.
Hmm.
And also, it's not philosophically plausible. The idea that this perfectly good, loving God is just kind of like kicking people into submission so that they bow down before him. They're
Yeah.
kind of head bowed. Like that doesn't seem like what a perfect being would
Yeah.
do.
And
Um,
one of the things I would note is that in that verse, it doesn't differentiate between the different actions that those on heaven and those on earth and those under the earth are doing. It just says that those in heaven, those on the earth, and those under the earth are, confessing ex homologieste, the Jesus is Lord, right? It doesn't say like, oh, ex homologieste, these people are doing this, these people are doing this. It's using the same strong Greek verb for all three groups of people, right? So then you have to kind of, you're an infernalist, you have to say, well, okay, it means three different things for these three groups of people, even though it's just one Greek word used, right? So it's a very weird argument,
right. Yeah, it would be
exegetically.
weird if I said something like, uh uh everyone will uh be in awe of my blog or something. But then for
Hmm.
half of people, I use that to mean like be in awe, as in they're just horrified at the horrible things my blog is saying. And then half of people are like,
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Yeah, we don't use
yeah, yeah.
language like that, and it doesn't. Yeah, I
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah, I mean, I do think I was surprised the extent to which, when you thoroughly investigate the biblical basis for the doctrine of hell, it really is just a castle of sand,
yeah, yeah,
sand castle, some might say.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
uh,
one of the chapter 6 of my book is sort of going through the development of hell, like genealogically, like starting with like what is Gehenna, what is it called in the Old Testament, the Valley of Hinnom, and then you go on and you get, Gehenna, you get Hades, well, Hades gets changed from Sheol. Sheol was the realm of the dead in the Old Testament. It becomes Hades in the New Testament, and then you get Tartarus from Greek Hellenistic imputations from Second Enoch, and then also Homer, right? So it's very fascinating, but when you get down to in brass tacks, you don't have this built out idea of eschatology. And so if you want to believe if you want to have an eschatology that is biblical, you always have to look outside of the Bible because you're not going to find this built out eschatology in the Bible itself. It's just not there. Um,
right.
that's one of the things I try and emphasize.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I do think like like the thing I was expecting was, I guessed that the reason why a lot of people would be universalists. And sorry, I don't know why my camera is turning purple. I don't know what's going on. That
yeah,
sometimes
it
just
was
happens. That's very mysterious.
nice.
Um, but I do think that what I was expecting to happen was that the biblical case, the scriptural case for universalism would be pretty weak,
Mhm.
that it would be sort of like the Bible vaguely gestures in the direction of broad themes where it's like it says love your neighbor. You can't
Yeah,
love
that's
your
that's
neighbor.
what I thought too.
So,
When people said it argued universalism, I was like, okay, that's not. Yeah,
right,
that's what
right.
I
I
thought
was sort
too.
of right. I was sort of
Hmm.
expecting like, okay, it's probably going to be one of those doctrines that because some people have a moral compass, they think, and are Christians, they think that the Bible says it. But really, if you look at what they actually believed, because nearly every Christian seems to be an infernalist. But then you look into it, and it's like all the arguments for infernalism, almost without exception, are just like contentiously translating the word ionios. Uh, I mean, there are a few small exceptions, but um,
Yeah.
But yeah, like nearly every example is just a contentious translation of
Hmm.
Ionios. And
Yeah.
so on the one hand, we have like things that are obviously probabilistically dependent on each other, where like it's all one argument just made in different places.
Hmm.
You know, they and so if you don't translate Ionios in that way, then 95% of the case for universal for infernalism goes up in smoke. In contrast with
I I'm gonna push back a little bit. I think
okay,
I would say that more like 65% of the case goes up in smoke. Because you still
okay,
have
look, I don't know the exact percent.
no,
Okay, you know,
I'm just thinking in terms of all the different passages I would think of. Like there's the paradigm from Romans 9 to 11 that a lot of Calvinists believe because it uses the words vessels of wrath and like vessels of like honor or vessels of like justice. And so Calvinists read that as, oh, people are predestined to be vessels of wrath and people are predestined to be vessels of, being
yeah,
just
I
people,
mean,
right?
I do think that there
So,
is a certain consistency to the Calvinist worldview, which has the only problem, the only two problems for Calvinism is that, well, I guess three problems is that it's evil,
yeah.
unchristian, and unbiblical, but
Yep.
it is at least consistent. But
I agree with that. I think
I do
it's like
think that even
psychotic,
I do,
it's evil, it's unchristian, but like it's a consistent worldview and you can apply it to everything. So yeah.
yeah, I do think that many of the passages that the Calvinists use are
Mhm.
best explained by universalism,
Agreed.
where if you think that we're all predestined for salvation, then it makes more sense of verses sort of describing predestined, at least gesturing the direction of predestination.
Yeah.
But I mean, the thing about vessels of wrath, I mean, the fact that God will set us and be angry at us
Hmm.
doesn't prove that it'll go on eternally.
Yeah. And one of the
Right. So
things I would
Right.
say
So
about
really what you need for
Mhm.
infernalism is you need like, you know, universalists don't deny hell. They deny the eternality of
Yep.
hell. So really what you need a verse that says that not only will there be punishment and post-mortem suffering, but that there will be post-mortem suffering that's everlasting. But
Hmm.
almost every time in the Bible, like with very little exception, when the verses say something about everlasting punishment, it's almost always so that it's almost always a contentious translation of Ionios. The only other exception other that I know of, other than the one you gave in Thessalonians, is there's one in maybe Isaiah or something. No, Daniel, I think, where it talks about people waking to everlasting shame. And the way
Hmm.
they translate everlasting is the word olam.
Yep.
But
Leolam.
olam,
Hmm.
I mean, olam described how long Jonah was in the belly of the fish for. He
Yep.
wasn't there forever.
Hmm.
And the fact that someone will be a forever, yeah, I mean, I think that passage doesn't support universalism at all. The fact that someone will be in everlasting shame about something doesn't mean that they'll literally suffer forever in
Hmm.
hell.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, I agree, but I do think that there are, I mean, some people point to stuff in Revelation, and I know Revelation's a very poetic, complicated book. I take the view that it was referring to the persecutions of Nero. It's a very historical book, and it's written for people at the time, and
You're a
us.
preterist. I know my terms.
Yeah,
Or well,
I would call myself a partial preterist. Yeah,
partial preterist. Yeah,
yeah.
but I do think, I mean, generally the terms in Revelation where they show it, like there's the verse in Revelation 20:10 through 15
Hmm.
and 21 and 21:8. And I think both of those use Ionios or use some like derivative of like I think one of them uses something like Ionion tone Ionios or something, which
Hmm.
is like ages of ages
Hmm.
is the most direct translation. So I mean I it most of it just is sort of contentiously translating some subvariant of Ionios.
Yeah. And one of the things about Revelation that I really like, a lot of people, on their first reading, if they're not really like paying attention to the text, what they don't realize is that in chapter 20 21, it talks about how all the kings of the earth are brought into the garden, right? Like it talks about how there's the lake of fire, and then it says that the gates are ever open, right? And that all the kings of the earth are being brought into the garden. And for me, that's like, wait, and it's using like ethne, it's using Gentiles, it's saying Gentiles. All the Gentiles are being brought into the garden, being brought into the garden. And so for me, that's like a very kind of big verse that shows like, yes, the lake of fire exists, but all people are being brought into the garden, and all people will eventually leave that lake of fire. The lake of fire is still outside the garden, but the garden's open. Everyone can be brought into it, right? So I think there is a universalist reading of Revelation, and yeah, so
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, and I think the universalist reading makes more sense of a lot of things. It makes more sense of the verse in Revelation talking about, everyone saying glory, glory be to God, including, the people under the sea. All I forget the exact phraseology, but
yep.
it's sort of describing very similar themes to the verses in Philippians and about every knee bowing and every tongue confessing.
Yeah, it's
Um,
interesting when it says under the sea. So, when it talks about under the sea, the belief in Jewish eschatology at this time was that Hades was like, literally under the earth, but they thought that some parts of Hades were actually under the sea as well. And so when it says under the sea, it's referring to this idea. And as we know, all people are in Hades, except for like some special like patriarchs, yeah, Moses and Enoch and Elijah. Those guys were whisked away to heaven. But in the biblical canon, the New Testament, everybody is in Hades, right? And so when it says that those under the earth are glorifying, it's saying that everybody is glorifying because everybody's in Hades. So I think that's a
yeah.
really good way to look at
Yeah.
it.
I found the verse says, and every Revelation 5:13, it says, and every creature which is in heaven and on the earth and under the earth and such as are in the sea and all that are in them heard I say, blessing and honor and glory and power be unto him that sitteth upon the throne
Mhm.
and unto the Lamb forever and ever. I also think that so I think there's more to be said for this universalist reading. Where first, I don't think the infernalist reading is forced in any way by the text. I think you can make sense of talking about the lake of sulfur by the fact that the lake of fire and talking about sulfur, that those were used in refining of gold and silver. And so there are other places where it talks about fire you being used not to destroy but to refine. So I
Yeah,
think that
Peter talks about this in First Peter. Mhm.
yeah. Yeah. And then it also makes a lot more sense of just the broad themes of it, where it makes more sense of talking about of Jesus as the lamb. Like talking about a lamb having there's someone who I cite in my article who I say makes this point. Like talking about a lamb having wrath is very weird.
Mhm.
Lambs don't get angry, they're lambs. But so if you the universalist reading makes more sense of that because it says that the wrath of the lamb is not distinct from the lamb's love, but instead as an aspect of Jesus's sort of goodness and bringing people to him.
Mhm.
That they have to suffer for purification purposes, but they don't go on suffering forever.
Yep. Yeah. No, that's a good point. I didn't think about the idea of the lamb and how a lamb's not wrathful. I've just always looked past that metaphor, but it makes sense. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that makes sense. That's good. Um, do you I saw you mention a couple of stuff about universalism in history, like you mentioned Origen and Gregory of Nyssa, and you mentioned J.W. Hanson's list of all the people that he thinks are universalist. Do you think that universalism was a largely popular position? I know you can cite Basil, who uses I forgot the exact Greek words, but he uses like poly something, which means like many people.
I think
Um,
he said something about the hoi polloi.
Hoi polloi, yeah, okay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think Basil said that, and I think there might be a quote from Augustine saying something similar
There
about how
is
yeah, a lot
in
of
his
people want to
commentary
see.
on Lamentations, it's he says that he basically says that like there are a lot of people supporting this position, and he says that it's not against scripture. So it's interesting. He says that.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem, I don't know exactly how prominent it was, but it seems at least an open question exactly how prominent it was in the early church. And the idea that basically it was that, like, there's an idea that I think a lot of Baptists have where it's like universalism is a thing dreamt up by a bunch of modern heretics who don't take Christianity seriously and are woke liberals importing their woke liberal values of not causing everyone to suffer forever, of Christ redeeming all, and all these other repugnant values into the Bible.
Hmm.
Um, and I mean, I think that this at least shows that that isn't true.
Yeah.
You can debate about exactly how prominent it was, but at least many of the early church fathers and some of the, the most prominent ones, Origen, for example, who was, brilliant, got a huge amount right, was, an early opponent of slavery. Um, uh, I think it at least shows that it wasn't this like fringe view that only appeared by a bunch of liberals in the modern period.
Yeah, I think it's just important to show people that because a lot of people hear universalism and they either think of like the Unitarian Universalist Church, which is not what I want them to think of, or because they're not even Christian, they don't even call themselves Christian anymore. They're just the Unitarian Universalism. They dropped the label in like 2009, I think, of Christian. So I don't want them to think of that. But I think a lot of people just kind of hear universalism and they're like, well, everyone's being saved. Well, where's justice? Like this isn't just what? Like where's God's justice in all this, right? And
Yeah, don't you know that God may be
mhm.
loving, but he is also just.
Yeah, classic
What
rule.
destroyed?
Calvinist Calvinist mind explodes. Yeah, that's the response you hear is like, well, yeah, it says God is love in First John, and then, but it also says that God is an all-consuming fire in Hebrews, right? And so it's like, well, yeah, fire purifies. We see this in other parts of the Bible, and I mean, there's a lot of ways to get around stuff like that, but
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
um,
We could also talk about Christianity if you wanted, and whether or
sure,
not
let's
there
do
are
it.
good
Okay,
reasons to be a Christian.
sure.
Um, Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, the biggest thing holding me back, honestly, is when I read the Bible, it's super weird.
Hmm.
Like there seems to be just a lot of stuff that's kind of morally repugnant. The slaughter of the Canaanites. There seems to be a lot of stuff that, like, okay, maybe Jesus. I think Jesus was. I think if you're a Christian, you should think Jesus was a universalist. Um, but it is at least kind of concerning that he wasn't clearer, right?
Hmm.
That he did not make it so that he was sufficiently ambiguous that like the vast majority of Christians have believed one of the most wicked and unchristian doctrines in the history of the world. Like it's at least concerning that he wasn't clearer. He could have been very clear. He could have said, "Now to be clear, let me be clear. I believe that all will be saved, and that when I say Ionios, I mean of the ages, not eternal."
Hmm.
Right? Okay, that would have cleared it all up. And
Awesome,
so,
yeah.
yeah, and so I mean, there just seem, and I mean, it's weirder in the Old Testament, but there's also a lot of weird stuff in the New Testament. Like, it's very hard to see why, if God was in some way inspiring it, why there would be so many things that seem like apparent errors, so many contradictions, so much weird stuff.
Yeah.
Now I mean I know there are attempts to explain away all the contradictions, but I tend to not find those that
Yeah,
plausible.
yeah, I mean I'll kind of just talk a little bit right here. I largely agree. I think there are some insurmountable contradictions that just can't be explained away. I think one of the easiest ones is the difference of the day when Jesus rose, like the time. Like you can't like there's no early dawn and then it's like a whole nother time in John. Like compared from John for the synoptics, it's a very different picture of when Jesus rose. I think another one is Judas. Judas is being killed in two different ways. He hung himself, and the other one, his guts like spilled out or something. I that is very odd. Unless someone gets hung, and then while he's hanging himself, he gets a knife and he cuts his guts out. I think that's a
Yeah.
little. I think that's playing around with the text too much. So I think there are some contradictions which are insurmountable, but I think there are other contradictions like alleged ones like the two temple cleansings. I think that there were two temple cleansings. John talks about like two like a temple cleansing at the start of Jesus's ministry, right? And people say, oh, well, the synoptics put it like at the end. And so were there two, and or was John just like mixing up the details? I think there were two. Um, but I think there's good enough reason to think the details differ so much. Um, the language used to describe what is happening in the temple cleansing is different between the two, like sufficiently. So that's a contradiction for me. It's like not really. I think the resurrection stuff, I think a big contradiction, one of them would be that when Paul says that the flesh and blood cannot be resurrected, and then you see at the end of Luke, it basically says that flesh can be resurrected, right? And so that's a pretty big contradiction, I think. But yeah, I mean, those are a couple. But for me, I'm not an inerrantist. I think that it's a modern ideology to be an inerrantist. I think that reading the text as people understood it at the time, they probably didn't think it was inerrant. They were getting a letter from this guy they knew named Paul. No one gets a letter from their friend named Paul, and they're like, everything in this letter is 100% true. Like, that doesn't happen, right? So they read the letter and they're like, yo, this is awesome. And then, maybe he gets some stuff wrong, but my friend Paul, like, he messes up. It's okay.
So,
Um,
so what do you think? So what's your notion of inspiration? I assume you think it was inspired. I
yeah,
assume
I mean,
you don't just think like Jesus did stuff, people happened to write it down, and then it got collected into an anthology. I assume you think you hold to some there's some important sense in which it's inspired.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's inspired insofar as God communicates his message, and then it's understood through our cultural and ideological proclivities that we're burdened with in our historical and setting. So, that's
Wait, so maybe I'm not. I don't think I'm quite getting a clear picture of the doctrine of inspiration.
mhm.
Is the idea that so like what are the necessary conditions for it to be inspired?
I don't really have any.
Okay,
If I had to think for a second, a necessary condition for it to be inspired, um, I don't
I
know
guess
because
sorry. I meant to say what's a sufficient condition?
sufficient. Yeah,
Well,
okay.
well, I guess no. I mean, it may no.
A
What is
necessary and sufficient
necessary and
condition.
sufficient? Yeah, okay, that's better, right? Because if it was
Okay.
sufficient, it would just be well, if God wrote it, that would be
Yeah.
sufficient. And then
Yeah.
necessary, well, it has to be written down
Yeah.
to be.
Yeah.
So
Okay,
okay,
necessary and sufficient. Um, I think, well, one of them would be that it had to be accepted by the church at the ecumenical councils, right? So that for me kind of ratifies it as being inspired. Um,
so do you think, like, suppose the church had played out differently, right? Suppose that the church of the early ecumenical councils had, rather than including Revelation, had included like the Apocalypse of Peter. Would
mhm.
that then be inspired?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of texts which were rejected are still valuable for reading and have inspiration in them, like the Proto-Evangelium of James. It's a very important book in Orthodox liturgical tradition. All of our icons are inspired by it. We actually, in the Orthodox Church, we tend to think that we tend to go with that story of the Nativity rather than the actual biblical one. That's the one that's portrayed on our icons rather than the biblical one. So that would be an example where like Jesus was like born in a cave outside Bethlehem. Like that's what our icons show, rather than like in a manger. Um,
Okay, but so if you don't think that there's anything that special about in it, like if you believe you have a pretty liberal doctrine of inspiration, where you think the sense in which it's inspired is just it was accepted by the church, like
well, yeah, I mean I don't know if it's liberal. I think that the church was infallible in the ecumenical councils and deciding the definitions of faith, right? And one of those definitions of faith would be like the how many books are in the Bible. Um,
okay, so do you like so do you think, for example, that the exodus from Egypt happened?
I don't know. I think that if
Okay.
it did happen, it wasn't as many as is portrayed in Exodus.
Yeah. But I mean, then it's hard to see if you think that the Bible is that the Bible at various places intends to portray things as true
Hmm.
that just are not, right?
Yeah.
Claims this giant exodus happened, spends many chapters describing it, and then
Yeah.
it's just made up from whole cloth, or maybe not necessarily made up from whole cloth, but at least hugely exaggerated. Then like what why should we like read the Bible and take it seriously and like memorize quotes from it and so on? Like, I think that there's a worry that if your doctrine of inspiration is too liberal, it
Hmm.
becomes hard to see why, like, what actually is special about the Bible that makes it uniquely worthy of reading and
I mean,
thinking hard about.
yeah, I mean, I really, I, there's, I mean, I think I would say it's the most condensed form of God's revelation in written form that exists. That's how I would define it.
When you say it's the condensed form of God's
Hmm.
revelation, um, I mean, you think tons of what it says is false.
Yeah, because
Um,
people interpreted things based on their, cultural and historical
so
understandings, right?
okay, so is the idea okay? Is the following the idea that sort of like there were books that were written for various purposes. You know, Paul wrote his letters in order to reach the early churches, and then the Eastern Orthodox Church, with infallible authority, uh, declared that certain books were canon, right? And the Eastern Orthodox Church, in that decision, they were guided by God. And so
Yeah,
in there, and so
yeah.
then the verses that they picked to be canon were actually the ideal verses to be canon, right? So it would have been worse if, for example, Revelation had been replaced by the Apocalypse of Peter.
Well, Revelation isn't technically canon in Orthodoxy, so
Oh, okay, interesting.
yeah. I mean,
Um,
it's we don't read it in liturgy. We don't read it
Okay,
ever in
so
church.
yeah, so let's say I don't know
Yeah.
some random book, like some kind of obscure book in the Bible, got
Yeah, I
replaced.
mean, again, canon for us is just very, very, we don't have these like exact demarcations. Like we can, like, you should, if you're Orthodox, you're expected to probably read Enoch, you're expected to read Jubilees, you're expected to read these texts, right? Canon for us isn't like as
So,
judicial, I'll say, as it is for Protestants.
so
Um,
do you think
mhm.
that in the writing of, say, the Book of Genesis, that God played a role in the creation of the book itself, or did He just play a role in making the tradition decide to add that to the canon because
The
there was something?
interpretation of Genesis, the theological interpretation that the church fathers and the ecumenical councils have taken of Genesis is one that I would say is inspired. Hart talks a little bit about this in his book Tradition and Apocalypse, how like rather than view the text itself as inspired, we should view the tradition that has been accepted by later authorities as the inspired. So it's the interpretation that is the inspiration. Um,
Okay, so the idea is that um
I'm still playing
the
around with this idea some, but I think that I probably do lean towards that idea that it's the text itself may be inspired, but the real, uh, you know, full revelation of what the text is trying to say is only borne out by later authorities retroactively, like Origen's allegorical reading of Genesis and stuff, and this wasn't like known to the people themselves as they were writing it, right? This was only known later, and then the church has shown how this is true through the acceptance of these allegorical methods of reading scripture.
Yeah, so interesting. So I guess I mean it's hard to see why if the book of Genesis. So I can understand why on that account there would be something very valuable about, say, reading the early church fathers on the book of Genesis.
Yeah.
But then it's hard to see if the book of Genesis in its construction, there was nothing divine going on there. It's hard it's
I
hard to
think if you
see.
asked an Orthodox priest if you should just read the Bible without commentary from the church fathers, they would tell you not to.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I guess maybe I'm just hanging around too many Baptists.
I think they would tell you that, which is why like the Orthodox study Bible that like every Orthodox person has is packed to the brim with commentary or the church fathers underneath verses, right? And
Yeah, interesting. I guess I'll have to check out the Orthodox Study Bible.
it's
Um,
pretty solid. I mean, it's just the New King James Version translation, but it's just like packed to the brim with like stuff about Orthodox liturgy and like what is this? How does this play a role in later tradition? Stuff like that. So
yeah, I mean, and then it does become a bit hard to see why, if God is going to be intervening in constructing how people both interpret the canon
mhm.
and how how in what people include in the canon and how people interpret it,
Yeah.
that God is divinely inspiring that. He's not like speaking directly to the authors, but in some way he's making sure that what they write is infallible.
Yeah, so it
um
can be understood by like later tradition, right? Like I think
right
that
it, it then becomes a little bit hard to see why God wouldn't pick a more direct method, right? So like why wouldn't God just write a book? Um,
Yeah.
or like the Islamic idea that God just directly dictated the Quran.
Hmm.
I mean that one seems at least the most philosophically plausible. Then you read the Quran and you're like, this thing is definitely not written by God. But just the idea that if God were like trying to transmit his messages via a book, he would do it by writing the book or making it, equipping humans to write the book by, providing them a certain
I'm
kind
not
of
sure that I don't think I would agree with that. I think that like God relates to us in our historical circumstances, right? He doesn't like come at us from the transhistorical perspective. He engages with us at these historical circumstances as to not impose himself too much on us. So when, like, for instance, critical scholars go back and they're like, oh, this idea of Paul comes from Second Enoch and earlier Jewish tradition. Christians have been reading it the wrong way for so long. God, when he sees this happen, quote unquote, when he sees this happen, he's not like, oh, they got me. They got me. Ah, they got me. They fooled me. Dang it. I didn't know Paul would do that. It's more like Paul's understanding the revelation I've given to him in his historical context. And then later people understand it in their historical context and so on, right? And it's just the continual evolution of tradition. Paul was the start of the Pauline letters, right? And then later interpreters have understood the Pauline letters in different ways.
Okay, well, so I mean, I guess the thing I'm confused by is like there are lots of things that God could say in the that like suppose God had just directly created the book or had inspired the book of Genesis and so on
Mhm.
in a way that made them actually contain exclusively correct and important information. So, for example, maybe you
Well, I
describe the
think it
journey.
does. I think it does if you take a theological reading of it. If you read it as if you're trying to like take yourself back to the mind of a fifth century Jew in the Near East, then no,
But I mean,
obviously not. But I think that if you're reading it with a theological mind equipped with the commentaries, you are reading it in a way that is the most proper, and you're reading it the way God intended in that sense.
okay, but I mean, I would expect like if God has this ability, God could write things that were so good that even the
Hmm.
Southern Baptists would like start, not believing crazy. Like suppose God could have inspired the Bible such that it didn't have all those ambiguous passages that seem to point to the existence of hell. He could have described at various points the immorality of owning slaves. He could have described certain important scientific results. And people find it weird to imagine that God would do that. But if I were writing a book
Hmm.
to people around the year zero that I knew would be hugely influential, I would include some like important modern discoveries.
Yeah. I mean, I would think again, the people that are writing the book are trying to approach it from the best of their abilities, right? Like they don't have, all-seeing power. They can't see what's in the future. They can't see how 21st century people would understand their book. They
Yeah,
write it
I,
and
I'm not blaming those people. I'm
Mhm.
saying it's mysterious why God would use such an error-prone method to transmit his important revelations.
I don't think it's error prone is the
Well,
thing.
you're saying it's not error-prone in the sense that if you read it, putting with the Eastern Orthodox study Bible in front of you,
Not
reading
not necessarily, just any
right,
commentary of the great church fathers.
right, reading the commentary of the Church Fathers, and doing various other things, not being too literalistic. Okay, then you'll come away with exclusively with truths. I mean, I guess one thing is I just am and off to read more of the early church fathers, but I am a bit skeptical of that because I mean, when I read the Bible, it's so freaking weird. It is kind of hard to to think really that even with suitable interpretation that
Mhm.
I would come to conclude that it had great wisdom, but I could be wrong. Um, uh, and then the other point is just that even if it's true that if people read it in that way, then they would get the right result. It is a bit mysterious why God would make it. Like the vast majority of people don't read it in that way. So it is mysterious why
Mhm.
God would make it so that just the vast majority of people end up being led massively astray and believing certain repugnant doctrines, not believing other extremely vital doctrines
Mhm.
that could have prevented a huge amount of misery and suffering.
Hmm.
Um, so it is mysterious why it's constructed in that way.
No, I 100% agree. I think there was a quote from I'm quoting Hart again. Hart had a quote where he said something like, "The beginning of every religion is pure, and from there it's just a bunch of theological aberrations," or something like that. And I mean, I kind of think it's true. Um, that's it's not like an exact quote, but I know it's from his Roland in the Moonlight, where he talks, where his dog is talking, right? So
Oh
there's
yeah, yeah, those are funny articles.
those are great. Yeah. So I
I'm
know
sadly
it's
not a paying subscriber to DBH, so I can't read most of the stuff. Maybe I should be, honestly.
it's awesome. There's a lot of good stuff on there, but so um yeah, I mean, I think that you have these texts which are just so, I mean, like the way they could be read is so many different ways, and so you have to rely on another medium to you know, I guess mediate what you're reading. And that medium, I would say, is later tradition of the church, since the text is itself a part of tradition of the church. So you're just using later tradition to understand tradition, which is how all tradition works. Tradition doesn't just like pop out of nowhere, right? Tradition is builds up over time. Like I don't think the Bible is something different than tradition. It's just a part of tradition. And so when you use later tradition, you're just adding on to the tradition that was already there. That's the way that I and most Orthodox Christians probably understand the Bible is. It's always in the
Yeah,
context of Holy Tradition.
yeah. I
So
can I can certainly understand that if the idea is just that the Bible is not that the Bible divorced from Holy Tradition is sort of like is kind of bereft of much of what makes it
I
important
would
and
say it's
significant.
bereft of meaning entirely. It doesn't mean anything.
Um, well, I don't know if I'd agree with that,
Well, okay,
but
not like syntactically. Of course, it has like coherent sentences that have, XYZ, but in
yeah,
terms of like the
I mean,
theological importance, it
but
means
there
nothing
is the
and
mystery
bereft.
of like, I mean, so the Bible, there are all these books in the Bible, and they read in a kind of coherent narrative way, and
Mhm.
so there is a question of why, why God would make it so that only people equipped with the tradition could read it properly, such that basically like just many billions of people end up being massively misled about a huge number of doctrines. Um,
I mean, I think that everyone is constantly being misled because we live in ignorance of God. It's perfect knowledge. So
but I mean,
we're all being misled in some sense,
but
right? I
but I
think that
wouldn't expect the divine revelation to be sufficiently ambiguous
mhm.
that, like, why would God mislead billions of people about hell when he could have cleared it up with a single sentence? And Jesus spoke to the crowd saying, I don't think hell is eternal. And by the way,
Mhm.
the reason why, the reason why people think it's eternal is because I use the word ionios. But um,
Yeah, no, I mean, I frankly don't think Jesus was focused on eschatology. I mean, he was not worried about that. He was worried about a socio-political like doctrine, and he was worried about the coming apocalypse, and he was worried about
yeah,
this and
yeah, well,
that.
it doesn't necessarily have to be what Jesus said,
Yeah.
but like if God is inspiring the Bible, it's mysterious why he used a medium of inspiration that was such that it included lots of forgeries, for example,
Hmm.
that uh, it had lots of things that, at least on their face, seemed to be like repugnant.
Yeah. I
These
mean, the
more like
forgeries
it's
thing, I
mysterious
don't I don't
why.
think the forgeries is a big deal. I think, well, I don't think much of the New Testament is forgery. I take a pretty conservative view of Mark, Luke, maybe Matthew, and maybe John. Not sure about John.
Yeah, I think yeah, the thing I was talking about is forgeries. I'm not as certain about this, but my sense is, and this is a topic I haven't investigated that
Hmm.
much, but I think there is a pretty broad historical consensus that some of the letters that Paul wrote, some of the epistles, are forgeries. Do you agree
Oh
with that?
yeah. Yeah, yeah. I think Paul, I'm still split on Colossians and Ephesians. I really could go either way. It depends on the day. Um, today I think Paul wrote Colossians and Ephesians, but we'll see about tomorrow. I don't think Paul wrote First and Second Timothy. I don't think he wrote Titus. I don't think he wrote Hebrews. Um, he might have wrote Second Thessalonians. I'm not I'm not sure about Second Thessalonians. Um, but yeah, so
Yeah, so I guess I mean the thing that's mysterious is like the if you have, as you do, a somewhat liberal doctrine of inspiration, or
mhm.
not necessarily liberal, right? You think that it's infallible when interpreted in the proper light as prescribed by the church.
Yeah,
Um, uh, but if you have that doctrine where the plain reading is filled with errors, where if you just, you're a Baptist, you don't believe in no church authority. And sorry, Baptists watching this, I know I'm making a lot of derogatory Baptist jokes. Um, but
they're
in
used
my,
to it. They're used to it on this channel. They're good.
yeah, in my defense, they are funny. Um, uh, but yeah, so it's mysterious why God would write a book that misleads so many that like I can see the point, which is that God wouldn't that if you read it in the wrong way,
hmm
then you'll be misled. Oh, what a surprise! But the way in which you are supposed to read it is fairly subtle. It's hard to figure out, and it ends up being such that huge numbers of people read it in the wrong way when there are pretty
Yeah,
easy oversights that he could have
there's
made
there's
that
there's a
made
bit
it
of
so that
a
when
there's a bit
read
of
in the
a
right
what
way.
you're kind of getting to
Can I just
here.
briefly finish the
Oh,
sentence and
sorry.
then
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, no worries at all. The thing that's mysterious is why God didn't make an oversight such that when people read it in the wrong way, they end up coming to the truth on lots of important doctrines rather than just being massively misled. Um, I also think it's mysterious why the Eastern Orthodox Church is hugely wrong about lots of stuff. Like, why are so many Eastern Orthodox people wrong about infernalism, for example? But,
True. So I think what you're getting to is a bit of a testy topic, but you're getting to the Gnostic undercurrent that is inherent to every religion. That every religion has a secret gnosis. And it's not you you have to look deeper into what is there to really find that gnosis. And I think that that's kind of what Origen has shown with his idea of the allegorical reading of Scripture, where, or take Saint Gregory of Nyssa, or take Saint Maximus the Confessor, right? All these guys have said that, like, if you read the text as it is, you are reading as, in the words of Paul in Second Corinthians, you're encountering the word. Sorry, you're encountering the word, but not the life-giving spirit, right? So you aren't encountering the spirit. The spirit only comes from a deeper allegorical reading. And some people aren't equipped to do that. Maybe mentally, maybe they just don't know how to, right? So that's the part of that gnosis, that there is a divine truth that is inaccessible to some people, unfortunately, in this life at least, because for whatever reason they can't get it. Um, and so I think that that's what you're getting to here, is that testy topic of the gnosis that every religion has. Islam has it too. Buddhism definitely has it. Islam's is a crazy gnosis. There's a lot there. But you're getting to
oh,
this testy topic.
I'd be curious to elaborate on the Islam conception of gnosis.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I so much of my knowledge about Islam deals particularly with their universalist tradition. The appendix of my book is a 14-page essay comparing the history of Islamic universalism to Christian universalism, and kind of digging into the very similar philosophical arguments both sides make, digging into the very similar scriptural arguments that both sides make. Like, there's a word that's very similar in the Quran to the Ionos of the Bible. Um, oh man, it's I can't remember it. Hold on, I have to look this up. Give me a second. Let me look this up real quick. Let's see. Word. It's a very similar word. Like in terms of like the meaning. Like, it can mean both like for a very long time, or it can mean like forever. And so a
Oh,
lot of Quranic literalists read it to mean forever, but the Universalist tradition in Islam has historically read it as not forever, because if you look at the Quran, there is no use of this word to say that there are people in hell forever, or in the people of the fire, that there's no people in the fire forever. this word is only used to designate paradise. And so for a lot of Islamic universalists, this word is let's find it. Dun dun dun. I'm gonna find this word. And here it is. So Khaldina and Abaddon and Khaldina can mean eternality, or they can mean just like a very, very long period of time. So these words are used in context to paradise in the Quran, but they're never used in context to hell or the fire, right? So Islamic universalists would say, well, here we go. We see paradise being shown as durationally forever, but we don't see the same words of eternality being used for hell. For hell, in the Quran, what you always see is akab, age, the age to come, right? Kind of the same thing as ayanos, right? You see akab, which means the age to come. So the people of the fire, the pagans, the Christians, the Jews, and maybe some sinful Muslims will be in the fire for the age to come, but it doesn't use abaddon and it doesn't use kaldinan because it isn't saying that this duration is literally forever. So that's a pretty interesting scriptural comparison that I've seen nobody make this personally. So for me, this was really huge when I found this. Um, but yeah, I think there's a gnosis in Islam too with universalism. So
Yeah, that's interesting.
mhm.
Wait, when you say a gnosis,
Mhm.
I mean, what you described was a universalist reading the Quran.
Yeah, but one that's like not apparent on a first reading, and one that requires like a later tradition. Like the guy that is really a big voice in Islamic universalism is a 13th century theologian named Ibn Taymiyyah, and he is sort of the
No,
big
I've
voice
named like,
piece. Yeah, son of Tamiya even. Um, and so he's a big voice, and so for Islamic Universalists, they use him as like their focal point. Like this guy was inspired by Allah, and so we should understand his interpretation of the Quran rather than, some crazy Hanbali theologian at the same time or whatever. So
yeah, that's
but
interesting.
yeah,
But
so that I wanted to
but
point
yeah, I
that
mean,
out.
so even if they all have their own theosis, I mean, the thing that's mysterious is like, okay, so I mean, here's an analogy. Imagine that I was writing a book, and
Hmm.
this book was hugely influential. It would influence many tens of billions of people. And really, the correct way to read it was there's a secret code hidden inside it. Really, the correct way to read it is to read the code. So you read every second letter or something.
Hmm.
But but imagine that very few people will read this code,
Hmm.
right? The pretty sizable majority, say 90%, will just read the plain meaning of the text. It would be very weird if the plain meaning of the text were such that it just massively misled people and led them to have horrible beliefs and so on. Like, why not just make the text, not be massively misleading and lead to people having uh, various immoral beliefs?
I mean, I think I can name really influential books that are extremely misleading and very ambiguous. Heidegger's Being in Time, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. I mean, these books are extremely complex. No one really knows what they're saying. Everyone has their own interpretation that disagree with one another, right? And they're still super influential. And
They're
Hegel
not the
wrote it
work
with
of
that purpose.
they're not the word of God. I
Well,
would
yeah, but
expect.
you said you're writing a book, so.
Oh, sorry. I should have said like, yeah, right. So if I were writing a book, probably my book would be deficient in all sorts of ways. But if we imagine the best book anyone could write,
Oh, okay, okay. That makes more sense. Okay.
yeah, yeah, it's hard to see why. Yeah,
Yeah, I
I
mean, I
know
would.
when I and maybe part of this is just sort of like maybe this will be abetted a bit when I read, or not abetted. It'll be undermined a bit when I read hopefully the Eastern Orthodox Study Bible. But every time I sort of think about the arguments for Christianity, and they seem pretty good.
Mhm.
And whenever I read the Bible, it's so weird, and it all seems nutty that it is hard to see like it seems hard to believe that it is in some important sense the word of God.
Mhm.
And now if what you're saying is right, okay, maybe that's because I'm reading it wrong. I'm just reading the plain meaning rather than taking into account what the early church fathers said about it. But it is a little bit mysterious why uh why make your religious tradition such that the plain reading misleads billions of people if you're God.
I mean, I think all religious traditions have that again. I mean, I would
I mean, the mere fact that all religious traditions have it, I mean, that doesn't mean that it's justified, right? If you think like me that all, you're a generic theist, all religious traditions are in fact false,
mhm.
then, you know, it's not the end of the world that all
I
religious
think I
traditions.
think they all share in parts of the truth. So we have the opposite
I mean, I
view.
agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly how far down the road of they're all right I go.
I don't
Like,
I don't take they're all right, but I think that
right, no, no,
God's
no, right,
revelation
right.
is not like geographically fixed to a small portion of the Near East, right? I don't that's silly.
Right. Yeah, I
Um,
get right. Yeah, I think certainly they all got certain elements right. I don't know exactly how much they all got right.
yeah, I
Um,
can't like give like a exact,
yeah, what percentage of
quantification.
Islamic doctrines are true? Yeah, it's
Yeah,
not
I
exactly more or less than
quantification.
68% of them.
Yeah, I
Um,
got to think about that one. I don't know, but yeah, no, I think you make good points, but for me, it's just if you see the Bible as itself, just itself a part of tradition, it's not its like own special ontological status, like the way that that's the word that Gavin Ortland, the Protestant guy on YouTube, says. He says the Bible is its own special ontological status. I completely reject that, as do all
yeah.
Orthodox people. We don't think the Bible is special ontological status. We think it's a part of holy tradition. And so if you think that, then you just view it then you just view later tradition as not like this external thing that's impinging itself on the Bible, but just further building on that tradition, right? So do you see what I mean here? Like if you take a Protestant view of the Bible as scripture is here, tradition is here, two different things, then you view tradition as impinging itself on the Bible. But if you take an Orthodox view, this is the circle of tradition and here's the Bible. It's in it, right? So for me it's just like later commentary is just building out further tradition and correcting some
Well,
tradition, right?
yeah, right. Yeah, I can see the point, and I agree that I think that's a better response than I think it's easier to have that response than for a Protestant. I mean, I think a Protestant has to take a pretty liberal response of saying, for it to be plausible, having a pretty liberal doctrine of inspiration and saying, look, you know, uh, God God gives us free will. He gives us the freedom to make errors, even in our transmission of divine revelation. So I don't think it's the most implausible thing in the world. But I guess I mean then the thing that's mysterious is why it is relayed in that way. Like
Hmm.
why God doesn't make the plain reading of the text be such that it provides all sorts of important moral truth. The other thing, and I'd have to look more into the history of the Eastern Orthodox Church, but like if it really were the case that they were receiving something much nearer to direct divine revelation, I'd expect them to get like way more right than the others. And my sense is maybe they get a bit more right, but I don't get the sense like it's not like the Eastern Orthodox has figured out like very early on that factory farming is wrong and that slavery was wrong. Like,
They kind of well, I mean, I don't think the Eastern Orthodox. I don't think there were different churches early on. I think the Orthodox Church began in 33 AD when Jesus died, right? So I don't take the view that like Orthodoxy was like this thing that happened later. I think all these other churches broke from Orthodoxy. The Orthodox Catholic Church in the first millennium before the schism is the is the prior form of the Orthodox Church today. It's the same church. But yeah, that's just a that's a historical difference because a Catholic would say that the Catholic Church was always there. So we just yeah. Um but no, so my point would be that I think that the a lot of fathers in the early Orthodox Church did get a lot right. Saint Gregory of Nyssa was anti-slavery. He was anti-subordination of women. You can read Saint Maximus the Confessor for really just like he was writing in like the seventh and sixth, seventh, sixth or seventh, one of the two. And he was talking a lot about like how Mary how like the devotion to Mary shows like the value of the equal value of women to men. He's like, why would we like venerate this person that's lesser than us, right? So I think that you have a lot of these good social values, basic stuff like being against slavery and being against the subordination of women in the early Orthodox Church. And I think that I think the Orthodoxes have always been more or less okay on this. I mean, slavery has existed for a very long time in every country in the world, but I think that there were a lot of early proponents of anti-slavery. Um, so
Yeah, I mean, I right. So it may be that the Orthodox were ahead of their time in various ways. Um, it is difficult to see why, even if the Orthodox were on average better on slavery than on other people, like if the claim is really that, okay, the reason why we're getting biblical claims wrong is because you're reading it in the wrong way. Really, the way to read it is with an understanding of tradition, and with the Orthodox study Bible in one hand, and knowing the early
that
church
was just an
fathers.
example. That book just came out. That's not needed for understanding divine revelation. It's just an
Yeah.
example. Yeah.
Wait, it
But
just came out? I thought you said like every Orthodox.
yeah, it came out like 7 years ago, but every Orthodox has it. Yeah.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I don't, not to make too much of that example. It's a funny,
Yeah.
a funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, so if you have, then I think I would expect so my objection was like, so the Bible seems to have lots of errors and weird bits. And your claim was, well, it has errors and weird bits if you read it like a Baptist, right? If you
Frankly,
read
yeah.
it, yeah, if you read it like a Protestant, you'll get a
I
lot
think,
wrong.
and this is gonna get to my. I'll briefly say my core critique of Protestantism is it's the lack of trust in the Holy Spirit. It's the belief that the Holy Spirit's revelation has stopped in the first century, right? And that I think that if you believe in the Holy Spirit, if you're a Christian, you should believe that the Holy Spirit is continuing to reveal itself, and that it's continuing to inspire later authorities, right? And so a Protestant, if they're a honest Protestant, I would say that they would have to believe these incorrect parts of the Bible because that that is what was revealed at the time. Like when Paul talks about Enochic cosmology and how um, each nation of the world has its own um, divine heavenly angel that sits atop the heavens and instructs the king what to do. If you're a Protestant, you should believe that. That's what Paul talks about at the start of Romans 13. So I don't, but if you're an Orthodox, you go, oh, well, we can read this in very different ways. Church fathers have a lot of various thoughts on it. We can say that, okay, Paul's cosmology is obviously wrong, right? We don't believe that there is a literal, like, tiers of heaven, third heaven, fourth heaven, fifth heaven, following Enochic cosmology. But we do believe that there is true in some sense that there are rulers of the heavens, whether good or bad, that can communicate with the rulers of this world, and that we should try and have a society where rulers of this world are communicating with the good rulers of the heavens, right? It's a very orthodox way to read the start of, Romans 13. But a Protestant should read it if they're honest in that very literal fashion. And I think that that's the death blow to Protestantism. And they try and get around this, but they really can't. I mean, there's no way to get around this if you reject the view that the Holy Spirit has continued to inspire later authorities, right? So that's all to say that
I mean, I
I
think if you're a
think,
pretty liberal Protestant, you can think that the Bible isn't, that just the Bible got it wrong.
yeah, but then I would just wonder what gets it right then, right? Because if the Bible is your sole ontological authority, well, higher than every
Right.
authority, what gets
Well,
it
I'd
right?
imagine if you're a very liberal Protestant, you wouldn't think that the Bible is the sole infallible authority. You wouldn't affirm sola scriptura if you're a liberal
If you're a
Protestant.
liberal Protestant, you would still think the Bible is more valuable than traditions. That is what would make you a Protestant, right? You would,
Right. Well, the Bible would be more valuable than traditions, but you might still think that the Bible isn't that valuable. Like it's certainly not infallible, and it certainly
yeah.
got something wrong. So if the light of reason uh, sufficiently
But then the
shed,
question would be, where do you get your divine revelation then? That's
well,
incomplete. That seems like an incomplete system to me. I have a complete system,
well,
right?
well, you get your divine revelation from the Bible. Now,
It's wrong though.
what?
It's wrong though, according to that view.
Well, some of it's wrong, but you might think that we don't have some direct way where we can be certain that certain things came from God. We can be pretty confident that certain things came from God if they're these long-standing biblical themes and they're powerfully tested and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
but we don't actually get anything like the kind of certainty that that say a Catholic has, that you know, these specific things are uh, infallible and can't be wrong. But I guess I mean, you know, I'm not a Protestant either, so
Yeah.
yeah, so I think there's the mystery I was talking about before about why not make the plain reading of the Bible better. But then there's also the fact that if the Eastern Orthodox really are just constantly getting revelation from God, essentially, then it becomes mysterious why the Eastern Orthodox are not like just you know so far like okay yeah maybe some of them were early on slavery for example on realizing that slavery was wrong, but why aren't they just like super far ahead of their time? Why for example do the Eastern like why aren't the Eastern Orthodox all convinced of veganism, for instance? Why aren't the Eastern Orthodox all convinced that like you have strong obligations to give to effective charities or something? Why
I
aren't
don't
the Eastern
think, I mean, I don't think veganism is correct. I don't think that's ever going to be revealed as accurate. I think that animals have souls, but that's not something that should bother us. We are the royalty of creation, and everything else is a lodging to us. We can move it around as we want. Should respect it because it's still ensouled. I think everything is ensouled in some sense. Panpsychism
okay,
right
well, I
there.
guess you and I have very different views on this. I
Yeah.
mean, do you think at least that factory farming is seriously wrong?
Um, yeah, I mean, like when I watch those videos of like chickens getting their like heads cut off by like electric knives and stuff, I'm like, yeah, I don't like that much. It's a visceral gut reaction that seems to be pretty evil and seems to be something we shouldn't do to beings that are ensouled.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think animals can suffer, and so it's bad that we're like causing billions of them to suffer and all
Yeah,
that.
animals can suffer. Yeah, I think they can. Yeah.
But I mean, do you think that we have an obligation to give to certain effective charity? I mean, I guess maybe you and I will have very different moral views, but it is a bit mysterious why, if basically like they're constantly getting these significant direct revelations from God, why are they only a little bit ahead of their time? Like it's not clear whether
Well,
the
I
Eastern.
mean, I think ahead of your time. I mean, you're like presupposing like modern day progressivism is like the right way to move. I'm not a progressive. I'm consider
Well,
myself
no,
pretty conservative, I guess. I don't.
when I said ahead of their time, I didn't mean just like believes, you know, in all the modern values. I mean, though I mean, I do believe in a lot of modern values that I think the Eastern Orthodox generally don't.
Yeah, they
Uh,
don't.
uh, but
But I would,
like,
but I would justify not believing in those values not through the Bible alone, but through later tradition, which has shown that the Bible is correct, right? Tradition
yeah,
can both
but I
correct and like verify the
I mean,
Bible.
so for example, why wasn't it clear to everyone in the tradition, in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, that slavery was wrong and that the subjugation of women was wrong? And um,
I mean, I think it was pretty clear. I mean, like women have always been deaconesses in church. Um, that's like in various councils and stuff. They talk about that. Um, we have various canon laws on deaconesses, what they can and can't do. Um, so deaconesses have always been recognized in the church. Um, so that's something that I think a subordination wouldn't
okay,
that
well,
that I would view the idea of deaconesses in the church as a correction to First Timothy saying women shouldn't speak in church. That's kind of a correction to that. Later tradition came around, they're like, actually, that was wrong. First Timothy was wrong. Women
wait,
can be
so then
deaconesses.
why didn't the Eastern Orthodox, why aren't they in lockstep being opposed to slavery, for example?
Um,
Maybe some of the early ones got that one right, but
yeah, I
if
think most of the world was always enslaving people. I think it'd be odd, be cool, but I think it'd be very odd if there was like a group of there was like a whole part of the world that just didn't do slavery ever. That would just be very weird. Everywhere we
But
go, there's
but
slavery.
wouldn't you think that if they were really if God was providing divine revelation to people, wouldn't one of the more important bits of divine revelation that He provided be to stop doing the slavery stuff?
Maybe not at the time. Maybe it was needed for their economy, maybe stuff like that. I don't know. Maybe like their economy would have like if God would have just like revealed it all and then the economy would have collapsed the next day, more people would have died. There could have been a higher net displeasure
Okay, I
from
mean,
everyone
right,
dying. I don't know.
that's possible, but I mean, I don't think that that's very probable. Or I mean, and there's so many things like that. Like, why not make it? Why not make? Why wasn't there a complete agreement that infernalism is false
Hmm.
among the Eastern Orthodox?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just a part of aberration of scripture, and I think that can lot of it ties into the relationship that the church had with the state for a very long time. Where like, the state would say, okay, you got to push this doctrine, right? And this doctrine would be proliferated in this very judicial fashion. Like when you look at the Roman penal system, the text in the fourth and third century about hell re reflected the Roman penal system. The stuff that would happen to you under the Roman penal system for punishment was literally the same that people would write about what happened to you in hell. It was a way of using imperialism and status ideology to sort of reflect into the hereafter. And so I think that a lot of that stuff played a part when the church started getting really involved with the state. Um, in the bad way, not in the good way. The state should be in the church, and the church should be in the state, but not in the way that it happened, where there was this sense of fear that to follow the church pushed fear so that people would submit to the state, and that shouldn't have been the way it functioned.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean, I don't find any of this that plausible. But I mean, we have been talking about the Bible point for a while. I could describe some of my other hangups uh
all right, yeah, I can
about
talk for another like we'll do like 30 minutes.
sure.
Okay, cool.
I mean, I guess I mean there's so much more. I mean, one other thing that I find weird is the Trinity.
Sure. I think it's a paradox, and I don't have an answer for it.
Yeah. I mean, I do think it'll just lower the probability that like there's so it's not the case that just anytime Christianity says uh says something that has a low prior probability, that makes Christianity less likely, right? Like flip out and put in any page of the Bible that gives a specific description of anything.
Yeah.
That'll have a low prior probability. But that wouldn't actually lower the probability of Christianity because the prior probability of someone making it up is equally low, right? So if it says, and then Gilead turned to Methuselah and said, blah, 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 like even though the prior probability of that is low, so is the prior probability of them saying that if it were false.
Hmm.
So that won't lower the probability. But the Trinity, I mean, like it's not hard to see how if Jesus was this charismatic figure who many people thought was God, how the doctrine would come to rise naturally, where the idea is that, okay, you have, these multiple people who are God, okay, and then from there, it's not hard to see how people would add on. So the probability that it would be said if it weren't true, given the background context, I think is not that low. While the prior probability that it is true is very low because
True.
it's such a weird and specific doctrine
Yeah.
uh, that like it would be one thing if they said there were infinite people in the Trinity. That would make some sense. But if they are
That
just like,
sounds very that doesn't sound very parsimonious at all. That isn't like I don't an infinite number of people.
oh,
I,
well, okay. I mean, we could talk about that, but I find there to be something parsimonious about it because it doesn't have any arbitrary limits. Like I think saying God, just like saying God can do everything, is more parsimonious.
mhm. Oh, you're frozen. You're frozen, Matthew. All right, guys. Matthew had to dip out for a second. He's going to be back in a little bit. We're going to get back to discussing the Trinity. This is a great conversation. Again, subscribe to Matthew's Substack, Bentham Bulldogs, and keep him in your prayers. Praise God. All right. Still waiting for him to rejoin. Just messaged him on Discord. So, all right, he's here.
Hey, sorry about that.
You're good.
I accidentally turned on airplane mode.
That happens. That's funny. That's funny. Okay, so the Trinity. I mentioned that I don't think an infinite number of people is parsimonious, and you think that it takes away the idea of arbitrary limits.
Yeah,
Because you see,
I also think that because the persons are not fundamental, like the idea would be that the persons like reduced to some underlying property like perfection. I
hmm
think it would be parsimonious, just like God has an infinite number of powers, namely the power to do anything, but that's parsimonious because it reduces to a power like perfection. But to be clear, I'm not wedded to the idea that there are infinite persons in the Godhead. I'm just saying if it said that, I would find that to be sort of plausible. Um,
I I've done a good bit of research on early Trinitarianism and the early church, and I don't think I've ever come across this position, which for me would give it a very low prior possibility. You can find positions of there's two people, even four people, but
who's the fourth?
sometimes it's Sophia. Wisdom itself becomes the fourth person.
Wow.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, to be clear, I was just giving that as a random
Yeah,
example.
but for
It's
me,
like,
that would
or
like
like
really
here,
lower the prior probability like automatically. Like even if I didn't think the councils were inspired or whatever, I would just be like, well, that's odd that nobody thought of like that we don't have any writings of like people debating this being like, I think it's three, well, I think it's like infinite. And we know that the idea of mathematical infinites were there at the time. So
do
I
we?
think
How do we know that?
well, we've well, I mean, Aristotle talks about the idea of mathematical infinites, doesn't he?
Okay, yeah, yeah,
I'm pretty sure he does. Talks about the difference between like a qualified infinite and like a quantified infinite or something.
yeah. I think he talks about actual versus potential infinites or something.
Yes, and he denies that actual infinites exist. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
that makes more sense.
yeah, okay, yeah, right. I'm not too wedded to that one in particular, but I mean, I would be happy to defend it because
Hmm.
I do actually think it's a sort of plausible idea,
Hmm.
but it is mysterious why, um, like I think the Trinity is going to lower the probability of Christianity because it's very improbable. And then I think a similar thing about reincarnation, where it's and I've gone back and forth on these a little bit, but I
Hmm.
think this is my current view, where it's easy to see why reincarnation would develop. Not reincarnation, incarnation would develop given the views of the time. Where if you thought that sort of like if you had the kind of repugnant views at the time that sort of like others can die for you, lambs get slaughtered for the sake of our sins, then there is something plausible about, okay, well, God gives the ultimate sacrifice. He becomes flesh and gives himself as a sacrifice. But if you really think in some way that none of us deserve heaven, but then God comes down and atones for our sin or something,
Yeah.
it's just the doctrine. It becomes hard to make sense of. So there are a lot of things that any Orthodox Christian will have to affirm that I find pretty implausible, and so I think that a sort of conjunction of these will pretty thoroughly lower the probability of
Yeah, I mean,
Christianity.
for me, the Trinity, it's just a matter of complete faith. I mean, I would say that like I've had personal revelation of it and visions before, but that sounds
Oh wait,
insane.
what?
Yeah, and then anyways, we'll move on from that. But
Wait, I want to hear about that.
I have a lot of interesting mystical experiences that reveal things to me. That is how I form my beliefs. It's like when Wittgenstein said I saw it in a dream or something, you know.
Yeah, well, I saw in a dream that SIA was no, kidding.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
But no, so stuff like that is I don't know.
have you
Uh,
had mystical experiences that convince you of beliefs that you didn't previously hold?
let me think. Yes, I can name one right now.
Sure.
The value of ancestor veneration.
Okay.
I
Cool.
never did it before, and I did it once, and I had like a very powerful experience. And I was like super like questioning about doing it, but I did it, and then I was like, wow, this is like really powerful. But yeah, anyways,
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. Okay, if you've had a divine revelation vindicating the Trinity, that's a good reason to think the Trinity is true. But I mean, do you at least agree that the fact that if you have not had a divine revelation vindicating it, the fact that the Trinity is a very weird and hard to make sense of doctrine will
I don't
lower
think it
the
makes sense
probability.
intrinsically. I think that it's necessarily a paradox.
Do you agree that it will lower the probability of Christianity?
Um, in a vacuum, yeah, I think it would.
Okay, and do you think the same thing about the incarnation?
No, I don't.
Okay, so do
So
you want to elaborate on why the
yeah, the
what
incarnation for me. So the idea of the incarnation in the Orthodox Church and the early fathers was that God became man so that man can become
could
God,
become
right?
God?
Jesus took on our, yeah, Jesus took on our human nature and he perfectly united it so that we could be perfectly united to God. Like that's the idea. And it's this idea that the incarnation was not done as just like a ransom payment or whatever, right? But it was really done because God is calling us to literally be made more into like God, being made divine. We are taking part in divine nature, the divine energies of God in the Orthodox lingo. When we are, doing doing good things, praying, giving back to people, stuff like that, right? So that's the idea of the incarnation. Was it was meant to bridge the gap fully between human and God. And the transfiguration, I think, is the most perfect enunciation of that bridged gap.
Wait,
Um,
so how does the fact that God became human make it so that we can become in God?
yeah, so the idea is that like Jesus united human nature and divine nature, and he revealed that in uniting human nature and divine nature, necessarily he revealed that there was always this intrinsic link between the two. For instance, you can't take like you can't connect something to something if there is no shared properties. Or sorry, I don't like that language. If there is nothing that there is in common with the two, like I can't take an apple and connect it to in orange unless I have something like glue, right? Glue. Jesus was the glue that showed that apples and oranges are fruits, maybe you can say, right? So Jesus was the glue that showed that all human nature is itself already always divine. And it's in the process of
That's
becoming
how Jesus is often described as the glue that showed that apples and oranges are fruits.
real.
I don't know. I mean, all this talk about the natures of things and uniting them
Yeah.
starts to raise my suspicions. But
Okay.
I mean, so why is it that God, like, can you explain the mechanism by which God becoming human made it so that we could partake in the divine nature?
The mechanism, let me think. Sort of mechanism. I'm trying to think.
Well, I mean, it's just hard to see the connect. Like, could God allow us to partake in the divine nature without becoming incarnate?
I don't think so because the incarnation revealed that we could partake in the divine nature. It was the reveal that it was always already there, that possibility was always there.
Well, if it revealed that it was always already there, then couldn't, if it was already there, even if it wasn't revealed yet, then couldn't we partake in the divine nature even without God becoming human?
No, I think that becoming human had to happen. The
If a so suppose that like me walking into a room reveals that the room's walls are yellow.
yeah.
It's not that me walking into the room is what makes the walls yellow. And so if Jesus becoming human isn't what made our nature unitable with the divine nature, it's just what revealed that it was unitable with the divine nature. Then if it was already unitable, couldn't it be united with the divine nature?
I mean, I don't know another way it could have been. I don't.
Wait, so you're saying the mere fact that Jesus became human, it somehow united it with the divine nature?
Yeah, I mean it revealed the union that was already there in a sense. I mean, this we can get like I talked with Amos a little bit about this, but the idea of the like eternal human that exists in the Godhead as in potential fullness of the human race that Nissa talks about this, Origen talks about this, Maximus talks about this, the idea that in the Godhead, in the Son's hypostasis, there is the eternal human image, and that eternal human image is the totality of all beings in potential, and that at the end of days, all beings will take part in that eternal human image and be fully united to the Son and the Son united to the Father. So the idea is that the incarnation reveals that eternal human image is there, that there is already a link between divine and human nature, that all human nature is not like human nature qua human nature, but all human nature is human nature and becoming divine, right? Like I don't think there's a difference between like grace and nature. I don't think there's like a nature over here and grace over here. Grace is always permeating nature and it's shaping nature to become more like it, right? So
Yeah.
that's
Sorry, what time did you say we should wrap up by? Remind me.
I'd say like 120, 10 minutes, 15.
Okay. I mean, okay. Part of why I didn't buy this is it just does not make sense, does
Hmm.
not make sense to me. Like I can sort of hear the words, and you're like, okay, it unites the natures, but it just, and it's. I mean, there's a difference between being able to say the right words and the idea actually making sense. Which, okay, maybe that's not a very convincing argument. Just
Hmm.
X doesn't make sense to me, but it is hard to see like I mean, can you elaborate, what is the process of the human and divine natures being united like? Is it a certain kind of experience? Like, elaborate on what happens when
Process. Well, I mean, the process of salvation is that it's that becoming united, the theosis, the becoming divine, right? That's the process of salvation.
so we
Um,
become like miniature gods. Well, not miniature, but I
yeah, I
guess.
mean, what C.S. Lewis says is we become little Christ, like Christ with a plural. We become little Christ, which is like we become like the Son. Um, so yeah, I don't know. That's kind of the
And
way that
how
I've always
and no,
understood
and
it.
how do we become like little Christs?
Through taking part in theosis, through worshiping God, through encountering the divine light, through interceding with the saints, taking part in God's divine family. That's how giving back, showing God's love. Like when when we give and we show God's love, we reveal that love, and then that person takes that love and then gives it to somebody else, right? And this is further expanding the process of theosis to other people, right? It's always a like communal process. It's not like a individual process, right? It's not one
Okay,
person's on
so
theosis, one person
so
is bringing other people into their
the
theosis.
process of prayer, of partaking in the divine light, and the various other things you described makes us like Christ.
Yeah.
Okay, so explain to me why, for those to make us like Christ, God had to become human.
I think I'm confused what you're asking. Why did God become human? I guess that isn't ever a question that early church fathers ever asked. The first person to ask that question was Anselm, right? And Anselm was the one who answered that, well, God did it to like satisfy like a propitiatory pay, right? That wasn't a question that was ever asked in the early church.
Okay, well, I don't care if it
Oh,
was in
okay.
the early church.
Well, my point is I rely on the fathers, and so I don't really have an answer to that question, right? That's not in the fathers. That's not. So
But I mean, if there's a thing that's like confusing and mysterious, the fact that it was not raised by early Christians doesn't solve the confusion and mystery.
yeah, it's never really raised in the East at all. It was always a Western idea. Even when Anselm brought it up, it never really made its way into the East. Um,
Okay.
I
Um,
just don't really have a thought. I don't have an answer for that.
okay. I mean, right. So I regard it as a sort of mystery, and it's just another thing that you have to believe in order to be a Christian. That
Hmm.
I think has a sort of low prior. Um, but yeah, so I guess I mean that those are kind of my three big objections to Christianity. That the Bible is weird, that the Trinity and reincarnation are hard. Why do I keep saying reincarnation? Incarnation are hard to make sense of.
Freudian slip, Freudian slip.
Yeah, I would be curious. I mean, are you convinced by a sort of like minimal facts style argument for
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah,
did you
probably. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I take
Yeah,
the
I mean,
First Corinthians 15 creed, and then I'm like, women in the tombs make sense, criterion of embarrassment. And then I'm
wait,
like,
yeah, could I just ask you a question
yeah,
about the empty tomb? So, I mean, one thing that I've heard several people say that I'd just be curious to get your take on is, I think, so the most common argument for the empty tomb is that criterion of embarrassment. If they were fabricating the story, they wouldn't have had women do it in sexist patriarchal Jewish society.
yeah,
But if women are, what various people have said is that women were the ones who were involved in doing stuff with tombs.
they were.
And so
Yeah.
as a result, we would expect women, if we were making something up with the tombs, just like if you were making up a story of Jesus ascending to heaven while in prison,
Hmm.
even though you don't say that prisoners are the most reliable sources, you probably would not. You probably would say that the eyewitnesses were prisoners. So, what do you make of that stuff? That kind of argument?
Yeah, so this is something that I've thought about a lot. And while I do think that that does make sense, it's when we look at later apocryphal texts and how they tried to hide this tradition of women coming to the tombs. When you look at these later texts, like John, when you look at not even apocryphal, but like later texts that were written at the end of the first century and the second century, they take away that tradition of women coming to the tomb, which for me sort of confirms that criterion of embarrassment. John takes it away. Then you look at later texts like Gospel of Bartholomew or the schizo those kinds of texts, those really weird apocryphal texts. They don't keep that story of women coming to the tomb, which was in all three synoptic gospels, right? And so it would seem very, very odd for a person to not keep that story if they want continuity with the gospel tradition, unless they were like, that's really embarrassing. Like the pagans are laughing at us. And indeed, that's what we see.
The pagans, they're laughing at us.
No, that it's true they did in Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho. Trypho, one of his points against the resurrection was you're trusting women. Women are your trustworthy sources. This is his point. He said, women are your trustworthy sources. Why would we trust women as being the foundation of our religion? Like that's that. So we see that, and we see not
But
only in Christian texts this covering up of the tradition in John and in later texts, but also in non-Christian texts, a questioning of the Christian tradition because of women coming to the tomb.
but it might be that as they got more divorced from what actually happened, that
But they
when
kept
they were
other
doing
stuff. They kept angels in the tomb. They kept all that stuff. They kept
well,
guards. They always kept the guards. The guards was a constant motif after Mark and Matthew and Luke.
it might be that as they got further from the other stuff, they were they did fewer things to make it make sense in context, right? So if I were writing a book, like if I were writing an apocryphal gospel,
Hmm.
there would be all sorts of things I would butcher that wouldn't
Yeah.
make any sense.
And we see those. Yeah, we see those butchers all the time.
Right. Right. But so that might explain why they were willing to delete the tomb, while the earlier ones who at least wanted to make their story seem more plausible, they would include the empty tomb. Um, they also weren't fully independent. Um,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah, I agree. Um, yeah, yeah, I think I agree. I'm still questioning about Q. I'm not entirely sure about Q because I do take an early date for the synoptics. So for me, Q would have to be in like,
Did you find that out via divine revelation? That
no, this is reading New Testament scholarship. Boring, boring. I know, right? Yeah.
yeah.
Um, but no, I what's interesting for me was the straw that broke the camel's back because I used to be very pro late dating. I put Acts in the 90s. I put Luke in the late 80s or something, I was like super pro late dating. For me, it was Acts. When I realized that Acts was in the late 60s, everything else started to make sense. Like that was like the straw that broke my back and made me do early dating. Was Acts. I think that Acts just seems so obviously early 60s before the persecution of Nero, persecution by Nero, before Paul's arrest, as we don't see it in the end of the text. Um, these types of things that are omitted for me really confirm the dating of Acts and the language used. It talks about the temple as if it's still in use and stuff. and the stuff they know about the temple sacrifices. These are things that a Jew living in the 90s probably wouldn't really get right unless they like had sources that lived earlier. But even then, like it'd be very weird how they get like these specific things right about like talking about the temple as if it's still in use. Um, and so for me, I think Acts was sort of my big thing. And then once I got Acts, early 60s, I just kind of pushed everything back or forward, I guess. And I put like, Luke a couple of years prior to that, and then Matthew maybe like early 50s, Mark mid 40s. And so if Q did exist for me, it would have to be late 30s, early 40s within 10 years of Jesus's death. So
Yeah, the the early versus late dating is just not a topic I've looked into at
that's
all.
fair. That's fair. I got really into it like 2 months ago. Um, but yeah, I still think John was written very late. I think John was written in the 90s. I'm pretty solid on that, though I do think there might have been a proto John that John later developed into, but that's a different topic altogether. But yeah. Okay. I'll move on from
Yeah,
dating stuff. It gets very boring and nerdy and yeah.
yeah. I mean,
Um,
yeah, it's a topic I plan to look into at some point,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I have not yet. And it's also not my area of expertise.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess I mean, so you like the are there other arguments for Christianity that move you a lot other than the kind of minimal fact style argument?
Um, I mean, just basic stuff about like Jesus existing. I mean, you can look at like Josephus and Pliny the Elder and stuff like
Well, I
that.
mean, the fact that he existed, that doesn't say that
Well, no, my,
Christianity.
my point is just like to get the bare basis, like that this guy existed. People are calling him the Christ. People are claiming he does miracles, stuff like that, right? Um, that's
Yeah.
yeah, that's just like the basic bare bones. But when it comes to like the actual faith claims and stuff, um, no, I don't really know. Not a lot of arguments. I mean, when it comes to the more like stuff that's obviously like um there are no contemporary sources for it, like Mary's Dormition and stuff. I mean, that's all faith-based. And for me, that's a fundamental of Christianity. That's dogma in the Orthodox Church, right? Like it's as important as anything, right? You can't deny the Dormition and be a Christian.
Sorry, what's the
Um,
Dormition?
when Mary died and like the miraculous events surrounding her death,
I see.
stuff like that, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so I mean stuff like that. I mean, I don't know. For me, it's just a lot of faith stuff. I don't really Um,
I mean,
universalism
I
is
do think like you can say that the core faith claims that, that it's not an unwarranted, it's not like an unwarranted or blind faith because you have good reason to believe it,
yeah,
which is that and then there are certain things that you believe because it's part of the tradition, even if it's not independently tested, like the stuff about Mary. So yeah, I think that can be reasonable. Um,
yeah. That's probably where I find. I just don't. I'm not super worried about creating like big causal explanations for this stuff. I'm just much more pro mysticism than sort of the Western tendency to over rationalize stuff, which I think can be good at times, but I think that some things aren't meant to be rationalized, and I think that religious truths fall in that category. Um, so, but yeah.
Yeah, well, so we've been going for yeah, so it is past 10:20, which is when you said you wanted to wrap
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
It's been yeah, very interesting chatting. Happy
Mhm.
to chat again sometime. And I'll read your favorite book, the Eastern Orthodox Study Bible.
It's not my favorite. I don't even own a copy. I just know of it. I use an app where I have like all the commentaries of the church fathers on it. It's actually a good app if you want to. It's
Oh
free.
yeah, what's the app called?
It's called Katerna, I believe. Well, let me pull up my phone to make sure. Katerna is the name. The
How's it spelled?
Catena, and it's a red logo with a cross on it. And when you open the app, it gives you the option of choosing Western Fathers, Eastern Fathers, or only early Fathers. And so you can pick all, you can pick none, you can pick. But yeah, when you read a verse, you click the verse and it has commentary from like at least usually two or more fathers on it. So it's pretty cool.
Wait, okay, so which ones should I pick it from in your view?
I mean, I just have only Eastern and early church because I'm not Catholic, so I don't really care what later Catholic writers say. But if you want all fathers from Catholic, Orthodox, and early church,
Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah. I'm sure it gives you more options because sometimes the verses I find it's like only one or two. Sure, if I put Catholic on there, I'd have more options of commentary. But yeah, it's cool. It's kind of cool to read along, and you see like one of the things interesting is you see a lot of early Christians realized these contradictions, and they were trying to like synthesize them and get rid of them or whatever, and they'd come up with these very very silly hypotheses to try and get around some of the contradictions.
Yeah, Augustine had the funny thing about the like two different staffs or something.
Yeah, yeah, stuff like that. Or when it comes to angels in the tomb, he's interesting on that and stuff like that. So
Yeah. All right. Well, it's been good chatting.
yeah,
Yeah, happy to chat again sometime.
for sure.
All right. Have a good day.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Thank you everyone for watching. This is a very long chat, a good chat, a late night chat. It is 1:25 a.m. And here I am talking about theology. So, what does that say? What does that say? But anyways, subscribe down below, guys. Again, I'm glad to have this interview with Matthew. He's a good guy. I'm praying for him. I pray that he finds the truth. And yeah, have a good day. Thank you.